everybody, and welcome to Moms on a Mission. We would love to share with you one of our amazing partners. It's an incredibly effective and toxin-free skincare line called Organic Body Essentials. Our friend Vicki Natali has an engineering background. She actually owned a device company and sold to pharmaceutical companies. And she really was more fascinated with skincare, and she just could not find a clean, toxin-free skincare line. So she created one called Organic Body Essentials. She actually started it in her kitchen sink. It's pretty amazing. That's just like the American dream, right? Just starting it in either your garage, your basement, or your kitchen sink. So go to organicbodyessentialstoday.com and organicbodyessentials.com today. And she has like 34 different products, lip balms, skincare scrubs, things of that nature. And just check it out. And then you'll save 5% if you put in the code MISSION. That's code MISSION. You'll save 5% at organicbodyessential.com. And we would love, our show's not free. We have production costs and things of that nature. So if you like what you hear, you align with this message and you want to support producing that, then please just grab something today and we would really appreciate it.
Yes, well, our guest today was a former full-time journalist chasing stories in our nation's capital and all across the United States. Now she's a freelance writer and is the author of several books, including her latest book, When Losses Become Legacies. And also she's a mom. I don't want to forget that.
That's
very
right.
important.
Her number one job.
Yes, exactly. So please welcome to the show, Kristina Cowan.
Hey, Kristina.
Thank you. Hi. Thank you. It's good to be here.
Well, thank you for being here. So please tell us a little bit more about your background and what you do.
So I was born in Ohio, outside of Cleveland, and I knew I wanted to write when I was 5. I always tell people that. So I have been able to write, something I wanted to do very early. I started, probably before I knew how to read very well anyway. So I started early. And I ended up in college outside of Chicago, and I decided in college to write as a journalist. There are a lot of ways to write. It was there that I got interested in journalism. I had an internship my senior year at the Better Government Association in downtown Chicago, and I worked on an investigative case. It was actually a murder case that had gone cold, and I was working with like a detective. It just was so much fun. And I'm 21, 22 years old, and I thought, this is what I'm going to do. So after I graduated college, I freelanced. I had a regular job that paid the bills, and then I freelanced on the side for 3 years, mostly for publications in the Chicago area. Trivium Media Services. I did a lot of work with them covering higher education. And then I went back to graduate school and said, I want a full-time job as an editor or a reporter. And I got my master's in journalism. And then from there, I ended up in D.C. I was a political policy reporter and editor. And then years later, I became a mom. And I stayed full-time in journalism until I became a mom. And then I went part-time freelancing. And I decided at some point, well, after my son was born, actually, I had postpartum depression because of a complicated birth. So I thought, well, I'm going to write a book. I'm a journalist, but I've never written a book. Why not? So writing a book's very different from journalism. I wouldn't say it's my favorite, but I learned a lot. So I did that. And I did the one you just mentioned with my co-author and friend, Christy Brunke. But my first love is still journalism, writing stories, that sort of thing.
I love that you've known since you were 5.
Yeah, I think I saw something, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I felt like I read something about you where you brought pencils or crayons to the bathtub. Am I making that up?
No, that's right. I think I have that maybe on LinkedIn or something.
Okay.
I did. I used to bring things into the bath and write stories in there. So it's just something. And you go throughout your life and you think, should I be doing something else? And you get into middle age and like, should I still be doing this? And I really don't know how to do anything else. I'm sure I could, but communicating through writing, and writers often say we organize ourselves by the way we write. And if we want to learn what we think about something or how we understand something, we write. And that's really true for me. I don't really understand something until I write about it. So it's an exploration process. But then as you're doing that, you bring people in, ideally your readers, so that they understand. And they maybe have a window into your understanding, but you give them sort of the impetus to go and understand for themselves, if that makes sense.
Yes. Yeah, like maybe use critical thinking skills is what I'm hearing you say.
Yeah, and right. And the purest form of journalism, which I think is almost dead. But
Yes.
what I learned in grad school and freelancing is you do this because you love to help people. Journalism, you build a story, you have the facts, you present them, and a true journalist never really inserts his or her opinion, right? Unless you're doing an op-ed. So you present it, you get all the news from various sources, and you let the reader make up
Yes.
their own mind because you assume that they're intelligent and that they can think for themselves. So you don't sway them. And that's what I always did.
I
So
think the difference that you're speaking about is the intention, right? The intention of your job. Instead of trying to indoctrinate and brainwash, you're literally just like you're serving food and saying, here, eat this
yeah,
meal, let me know what you think, instead of, indoctrinating before they get the meal. Say you like it, say you like it, say you like it, and then you eat and go, I
right.
like it.
Yeah.
It's really critical thinking skills at its best is what you're hoping for your readers to use.
Yep, that's right. That's right. And the last couple of years, I would say I've been just drawn to getting back to that, really wanting to equip people with the news and from all different sources and seeing it from all sides and letting them make up their own minds because it's very hard to find the truth these days.
Yes.
So but true journalism, if you look back in our history, it was a wonderful thing. It's what has made America America, the fourth
Yeah.
estate, right? Like freedom of the press, freedom of speech. We equip each other with information, and now we have even more information than we've ever had, but yet people are less informed, I feel like. So
Well, I'm so glad you decided to get back in there because we need real journalists because like we've just mentioned, true journalism is dead. I don't know
yeah.
exactly when it happened, but somewhere along the line since I've been an adult and we've seen it come to the forefront, especially in the last several years. So I want to back up just a little bit though, because I think I know I'm interested, especially with all that's going on in DC. And, we fondly, not fondly, I guess, call it the swamp, but I think that's what we call it now because
Yes.
so much bad is coming out. So I'm very curious about the time when was that? What was that experience like? What did it teach you?
Yeah, so I moved there with graduate school in the fall of 2000. Really, we had a program at my grad school where you could go to DC for the DC quarter, they called it. I think they now have students able to go more than just a quarter, but my school was on the quarter system, so it's about 3 months, right? And I went for the fall of 2000 to cover the election between Bush and Gore. Like,
Good one.
if you're a journalist, that's like the best thing you could do, be there for a presidential election. So I covered that, and my school had contracts with papers all over the US. So they would take their students and assign them to a publication. So I was assigned to the Imperial Valley Press. It's a newspaper in Southern California, San Diego County, sort of in the Imperial Valley around the Salton Sea. So I covered politics for them as related to their area of the country. I covered their congressman and I covered the election. It was so fun. And I had front page stories all the time. And I had my deadlines were a little later. I was on East Coast time in DC and I had to file by California time. So I had I had some leeway. But it was great. Right. So I was there. And after I covered that election, I said, well, I'm not leaving. I don't want to go from here. This is the best place you can be as a journalist. So I applied for jobs and I found one. Actually, my editor was an alum of my grad school. So he found me sort of through the internal networking of my school. And I covered higher education there for a publication called Community College Week. It was great. I covered 2-year technical schools, community colleges, and I didn't know much about them, but I really learned how policy affects those schools and how 2-year schools, I feel like in our country, we have this sort of stigma of you have to go to a 4-year institution, preferably an Ivy League. That's the best. Otherwise, it's like almost like a caste system of education, really, that we don't talk about. And I went to Spain at one point with this job and covered the technical schools over there and found that they they had more respect in some ways not, but in some ways they did have more respect for their technical schools than we do in the States, and how you don't have to necessarily stay at a 2-year school. You can transfer to a 4-year school, but they're wonderful mechanisms for both higher ed and the economy, right? So I was an associate editor at first, which meant I was reporting and traveling and also doing some editing. And then a few years into that job, I became the full-time editor of the paper. So I was in charge of everything. It was more responsibility, but it was great. It showed me how you put together a publication within 2 weeks, managing freelancers, making sure everything is accurate. It falls on you at the end of the day if the paper goes out and there's an error. So it makes you a little
pressure there.
It makes you kind of uptight too, right? So, but anyway, and from there, I was there for about 4 years. I moved on to cover energy and environment policy at Congressional Quarterly. I felt I wanted to be closer to things on Capitol Hill. So, and that was good and bad. It was a more stressful job because the deadlines were hourly, daily, weekly. I mean, I was always on call. I had a BlackBerry. People there worked hours on end. And it was okay when I was young and single. But it was in that job that I got married, and I would look around and see people older than me still at their desks at 10 at night. And I thought, well, if I'm going to have kids, I don't want to do this, work so many hours and never be around for my kids. So I left that job and went full-time freelance. So there was about a year and a half, 2 years between me freelancing and then having our first child. So, but all of that whole DC experience, and I was there on 9/11 too, living and working there on 9/11. And I ended up going up to New York City to cover what had happened because there was a community college right across the street from the Twin Towers. So I did a number of stories on that. I covered how 9/11 changed higher education in terms of the visas, the student visas, because the 9/11 hijackers had come in on student visas. And if you guys remember, the INS was disbanded, and that's when they developed the Department of Homeland Security because of 9/11. It was an incredible time to be in Washington, scary, but in a way, the country coalesced in this interesting way that we hadn't before. And when you live so close to something like that, and I lived close to the Pentagon, and I remember going over to see it after, it was startling. And there really aren't words to convey what that was like as a young person. But on one hand, it was scary, but on the other, I was right by the story, and that's where I felt like I should be. So, and it gave me a deeper appreciation for America, because like so many other people, I thought we're so safe here. Nothing's ever going to happen in America. So everybody had a wake up call then. So,
well, how did you go? So you talked about, you authored some books and was the editor of a paper and freelance writer and things of that nature. But how did you transition to researching and writing about topics as it relates to education, and then specifically classical Christian education?
Yeah. So my children are in classical Christian schools. And that's where I developed an interest in that. I should have known about them having covered education. I did cover K-12 a bit for the Harvard Education Letter when I was freelancing before I had kids. But in all of that work, I never came across classical schools. And the movement for classical schools really started back in the 90s, right? But early 90s. So I've not written a whole lot about them yet. I've done a few pieces. I wrote a long piece for our old school up in the Chicago area. We moved from Chicago last year, and our kids were up in the schools there. Our school there was Naperville Christian Academy. And we had switched from our first classical school for a number of reasons to NCA in 2020. So our last quarter at our old school was the lockdown quarter for so many people in the country. And, my kids were on videos and things, and that was okay. But we had already switched schools. So our new school was NCA in the fall of 2020, and they pushed to stay open, which was rare in Illinois, especially in Chicago. I mean, schools closed there for a year and a half. We knew people who were inside their houses and didn't come out. the school that we were at pushed so hard to make the kids have a normal experience while the world outside just felt like it was unraveling. In-person learning, we were under some masking requirements, especially for my son because he was older, but we really had a lot of freedom, and it was because of the school. So I felt I needed to write something for the school to applaud them. And I wrote this piece, and the school put it up on their website. And I said, but I think people around the country really need to know, first of all, what's happening in a state like Illinois, because Illinois is kind of like the California of the Midwest. Sometimes it gets passed over. You hear a lot about the crime, but really the lockdowns were so severe there. I mean, you couldn't go out and do anything normal. There were people riding their bikes wearing masks. If you went into a store without a mask, people would run the other way. So our school pushed hard to keep things normal for kids. And really, it was a lifesaver. What I call this story, our anchor, our hope. And it was an anchor, because otherwise, if our school hadn't done that, I feel like we would have left Illinois sooner than we did. Because when you have kids and you go through that, you think everything's for them to keep normalcy for them. But my husband and I would have been fine. But when you have kids, it's at a different level. So that story I wrote, and I called the ACCS, or I emailed them, the Association of Classical Christian Schools, and they have a flagship publication, the Classical Difference magazine, and they have a website that goes along with it. So I said, hey, here's this piece. Would you be interested? So they ran the piece fully on their website and then said, we're going to break it into 3 pieces. So they ran it as a series across 3 different issues of their print magazine. So in there, it was really the parents' perspective on what the school meant in the context of the lockdowns, but also what do these schools do? What are they about? So many people hear Christian education. And sometimes, honestly, people think, oh, well, it's watered down education. Your kids aren't going to lose a lot. Well, no, actually, classical schools are very, very difficult. They're rigorous. That's what they're known for. They're super hard. I mean, I can't imagine going through it now. I went through public schools in Ohio as a kid, but I've seen my 2 kids going through, and just on the one hand, yes, they're super challenging, but on the other, if you raise the bar for any child, they rise up to it, right? And that's what you want for your kids. So I really, in that piece, talked about how, language is part of it, language skills, Latin, different things, different aspects, because these schools are multifaceted and they're rich and wonderful. And they're not just, your average Christian school. And I don't think any Christian school is average. I think they all try very hard, but the classical method is unique. So,
well, and I want to point out that this is the way our presidents were taught. This is the way, in our history, when you look back to our founding fathers, and this is the way, these kids were taught back then when they formed this, constitutional republic that was so incredibly unique compared to the rest of the world. And I'm sure that's why the attack has been on education, just to stop the critical thinking from occurring. But it's super challenging.
Well, and I want to point out, I do want to talk about your piece just for another minute or two. And I want to share the whole title so that people will look it up, and we'll also link it on our page. But Our Anchor, Our Hope, Why Classical Education Makes All the Difference. And it's a great read. It really gives you a lot of great information about classical education, not just specific to Naperville Christian Academy, but for classical education all across the country. So I guess your kids have been in both classical education and in other forms of education now. And the piece really does help people, I think, if you're kind of trying to decide, why would I go to one school or another? But could you tell us, quickly, the difference between just private Christian education and classical, in your opinion?
Sure. And so I will say they've only been in classical schools. So
okay.
My son and my daughter have.
Okay.
So I don't know. I mean, I don't know that I could speak as an expert on other private schools. I know things that I've heard.
Yeah.
We have friends in Illinois who, our first classical school only went through 8th grade. So a lot of our friends there, they had to shift to other schools in the area. There weren't a whole lot of classical options for the rhetoric 9 through 12 years. So I heard from them and they would say, oh, it's fine, but you don't have that trivium, so the trivium is what makes classical, to me as a parent, what makes classical different is the trivium.
Can you talk real quickly about, just break that down for folks who don't understand what classical education is all about?
Sure. So the trivium, I learned about it when my son, like I said, I didn't know before 2014. So when my son was in kindergarten, we learned what the trivium was. And I think of it as 3 levels, but it's actually the 3 liberal arts: grammar, logic, and rhetoric. So those are tied to years of a child's life. So grammar starts in most classical schools. There's some variation by region, kindergarten through 6th grade or kindergarten through 5th. At NCA, that was up in Chicago, that was kindergarten through 5th. And then logic started 6th, 7th, and 8th. So my son started in logic up there in 6th grade. And then we moved to Tulsa. We were at a larger classical school here last year. So in 8th grade, he was also so he had 3 years of logic. He ended up 6th, 7th, and 8th with logic. My daughter, who's here at that same classical school in Tulsa, she's going to do logic in 7th and 8th. Anyway,
and they finish up with rhetoric, right?
With rhetoric 9 through 12.
Like high school is rhetoric.
With high school, right? Yeah. So grammar school is K through 6, let's say. Middle school is called logic school, 6, 7, 8, or 7 and 8. And then rhetoric is 9 through 12. So from just in layman's terms, as a parent, I can tell you, so what happened for my son and for my daughter at the grammar level, they focus on language, on building blocks, scientific facts, historical facts, math facts and processes, memorization, learning to read and attend to what they're reading. For example, in 2nd grade, both of my kids had the same amazing teacher, and she taught them to attend. So she would read them a story, give them a journal, then they come home after hearing the story once, and the parents were not to open that story or find it and reread it for them. The child retells the story to you within a day or 2, and you as the parent write down what they're saying, and then they bring that back to the teacher to see how much they captured. So that starts you on memorizing and really remembering and being disciplined in how you're paying attention, because we have so many distractions in this world, right? So that's grammar at its best. Learning math facts, repetition. One of the benchmarks of any education, I think, but I've seen it a lot in classical, is memorize, repeat, repeat, repeat. Because otherwise, how do you remember something like 2 + 2? Right? So they really drive that home throughout those grammar years, so that by the time they get to logic, they take all those facts and the knowledge of how to write, how to diagram a sentence, for example, and they put that together and they start to build arguments in the logic years, and they study fallacies, and they start to learn the art of arguments. So my son now will debate with me. And he started in 6th grade and pointing out, well, you can't really say that, Mom, that's a fallacy. I'm like, okay, I don't know. What's a fallacy?
Do they have
that makes me sound like I'm lying.
Yeah, you need a parents course so you can debate properly with your children.
They need to, they really do need to open some schools for parents so that we can catch up.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's because I don't know, half the time I don't know what he's talking about. So, and he'll watch things on the news and he'll say, oh, they committed a tu quo que, or they did this. So he knows a lot, right? And then they also have Latin. They start Latin usually in 3rd or 4th grade. And that Latin is forming the base, because all of these rich works of art in antiquity in Rome and Greece, they all spoke and wrote in Latin. So when your child understands Latin and they start to read these texts and go back through and dissect, they understand because they know Latin. And it's stretching their brains too, so that they can learn other languages more easily. So studying and some schools teach Greek too, which is another great language. So their brains are constantly stretching anyway. So by the time they're to the logic years, they're forming arguments. And then my son is just going to be starting rhetoric. He's moving into 9th grade in September. So it's those rhetoric years where they they present their arguments, they defend, and then the capstone comes in their senior years. And I think this is universal to all classical schools. They have a senior thesis. And in that thesis, they spend all year working on a topic that they choose. They have an advisor. The advisor approves the topic, and they research and they present sort of an oral argument at the end of the year. At our old school, it was on stage, and they have written paper too. And it's quite intense, but you, as a parent, you hear some of these. And we heard one when my son was in 6th grade from a senior. She talked about absolute truth and how she had been one of few of her peers in these sessions at different summer sessions somewhere. And she was talking about abortion and how they were debating things. And she was the only one to be, pro-life, right? She said, but I didn't care that I was anyway. It was a beautiful defense of the truth and how she stood for the truth and how there is an absolute truth, right? People go around now saying my truth and your truth. So anyway, that's an example of what is pouring into these kids in all of their years in classical. And they're respectful, they're wonderful kids, they're knowledgeable, and they can stand on their own, because when they go out into the world and they debate with people, they can debate and they win. Really, they win because they know how to debate. So
And they know how to think, critical thinking, and they limit technology. I remember reading so many parents, we need all these, bells and whistles in our school. And I love what you wrote about that. We really don't. Kids learn enough of that at home. They have plenty of exposure to that, but these classical schools really limit the technology, and I'm all for that.
I think that's brilliant. And I was just going to ask you, well, first of all, I want to say I graduated from Oral Roberts University, and we had to do this exact same thing when we were seniors in college. So, I mean, kudos to classical education and look, the kids are rising up and they're doing it 4 years earlier. So I think that is really amazing. So Kristina, I was wondering, like, when your kids you said they've always been in classical education, how did you find out about that? And how did you choose? Because I had not heard of it. And so I just chose, regular standard Christian education. I honestly haven't learned about this till the last, maybe year or two.
Yeah. So it's funny. I was thinking back through our experience this morning. So my son, we registered him at our local public schools up in the Chicago suburbs. The suburb we had moved to, we moved when he was a baby from downtown Chicago to the suburbs. We moved to the suburb because their public schools had high marks. They were known for being great, lots of resources, strong academics. So he's 5 years old, and we go and we register him. And they called us and said, well, he needs to come in for an evaluation and a test. And I said, well, why? He's been in preschool. He reads and writes fluently. He's fine. Everyone has to do it. So I took him in and I sat outside the door watching. A teacher brought him in and there's this big long glass window, and I see him doing different things. So she comes out and says, well, so your son will be in ELL. And I thought, ELL, but he speaks English as his first language, and you can see that he reads and writes, and he's been in preschool. Well, because your husband was born in France and, speaks French. So my husband was a missionary kid, and he was born in France, raised there, moved to the States when he was 17. But my husband is fluent in English. We speak English in the home. Noah learns English with us and at preschool. I'm born in the US. Well, no, we have to, I don't know I think it was Illinois state law that said, at least according to the principal, that because Noah's dad was born in France, he would be required to go into the ELL program. So I thought, well, you're going to hold my child back, and he's already doing great with language skills, so he's going to be held back. Well, my husband, he went in and talked to the principal, and she said, well, you can either redo your application and basically lie, which we weren't going to do. But we're going to lie and say he's not born in France. Okay. Or you can just deal with him being in ELL. So we didn't like either of those options. So my husband's accountant said, you should look at this classical school. Actually, there's 2 in our area. So we looked up both of them. One was 8 minutes from our house. I called like the next day. There was one more spot in kindergarten. We interviewed. It was 2 weeks before school started. So Noah slid right in. It was definitely from God, because
that's what I was thinking.
With all my experience writing about it, I never imagined putting my children in a private school, let alone a classical school. So, but it was a perfect fit. I mean, Noah had a class of about 16 kids. He's still really good friends with several of the boys. They meet every summer for summer camp. It was a phenomenal experience. Really great. So, and Sima ended up, she's 3 years behind Noah. So she came 3 years later, and they've both stayed in classical, and they're different kids, but it's been wonderful for both of them.
And so are the classical schools flourishing up in Chicago? I'm just kind of curious because, we don't hear a lot of great things down here in Tulsa about Chicago.
Right.
I wonder why.
Yeah. And a lot of that is merited. Unfortunately, the city itself is not doing well at all, but the suburbs where we were, it's tough. It was tougher before the lockdowns. I think it's a double-edged sword because you have all these parents see what the public schools were doing, particularly in Illinois, where the unions have a lock on things and kept the schools closed. Absolutely, they weren't going to open. So the parents were fed up and said, well, I knew plenty of people who said, well, we're not staying. We're finding an alternative. Well, where do you go? So a lot of the Christian schools in that area had an influx of people. In where we were in our suburb, Naperville, we had 2 classical Christian schools. And then in Wheaton, nearby in Wheaton, there was another classical school. So there were 3, but they're not very big. And by that, I mean less than 200 students total from preschool up to senior year. Both of our schools had been in churches. So we didn't have our own buildings. They rented space from churches. Our second school had more space. It was great, but they at this point, they want their own space because they are growing. So it's difficult because of the way Illinois law is. Our old school didn't take and still doesn't take any money from the state, so they can be truly independent. But during the lockdowns, you had the state breathing down your neck, threatening. And I protested some of the laws that they were trying to push through. I don't remember exactly what it was about. It was trying to take the private schools, like classical schools, under the state umbrella, in order to be able to dictate to them things like vaccines and masks and stuff like that. Well, no way. I mean, no way. When you pay and you sacrifice to send your kids to a private school and you have the means to do that, you want to have an extra say in your kids' education. That's part of the reason you do that. Well, no, the state wanted to take that away, right? And so I called the sponsor of the legislation. I talked to her legislative aide, and we just didn't agree on things. So it was scary, though, because I thought if this happens, that was in 2021, we absolutely have to leave because they will take our schools and mold them into just whatever they want, into another government school. And they will drown the curriculum and do all these things that we don't want as parents. So I'm always concerned about that because of having lived up there. And that's one of the reasons we left, because I don't like Illinois state laws. I really don't. They're not family friendly. They're not parent friendly. And that's just in education. That's not in everything else. So they're doing okay. And I think our old school certainly is growing. We want them to grow. They need to grow for those communities. But you also have to have parents really committed to the mission. If you're looking to just avoid certain things in the public schools, okay, but you really have to be committed to classical and believe in it.
And that sounds like that is a commitment, because they were, especially even like when with the grammar school, they were to come home and you're supposed to, write down what they say, which I really think is pretty cool. We have a classical school here in town. We have more than one, but this one, they have a parent community where they actually educate the parents. And so you're right. You can't just avoid what you don't like. You have to really embrace the whole different mindset that a classical education really provides and be involved. Well, how can our audience best follow you, Kristina?
My website is the best place. It's my full first name and last name all together. So Kristina, KRISTINACOWAN, KristinaCowan.com. So that's my website. Everything is up there.
Okay.
And I'm also media. I'm on Instagram. Yes. Okay. Author Kristina Cowan, AUTHOR Kristina Cowan.
Okay.
I'm not really on Facebook. I used to be on Twitter. I do consider maybe going back at some point.
Okay.
I guess it's X now. It's not Twitter.
X. That's
I don't like that.
That's another interview.
Yeah. That's another.
Yes.
I assume you're not on YouTube, right? I'm pretty sure you're banned.
No, I'm not on YouTube. I do use it.
Okay.
But I don't make a lot of videos or anything like that. So
Well, with the truth that you speak, I thought, boy, they're not going to like her. I bet she's got
3 strikes and you're
Yeah,
out.
we've got 2 strikes right now, so we're on the
do
board.
you?
Yeah.
Yeah, but we feel as like a badge of honor.
It is a badge of honor.
You know you're doing something right when
Yes.
YouTube gives you strikes. So.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, Kristina, for joining
Thank
us today.
you.
And I think you've inspired, you've educated us about classical schools. Loved hearing about your time in DC and how your kids are flourishing in a classical school. And we're going to keep those schools in Chicago area and Illinois in our prayers. I know they just elected another horrible mayor who is enacting other horrible legislation and letting unions run amok. So we need to keep Chicago and the whole state of Illinois in our prayers. And maybe when we get Oklahoma, we've got some great legislation going, but we could maybe go up and help people in Chicago.
Yes, right. Show them.
We'll put that on radar. But you can follow Kristina again. Let's tell that again on her website at KristinaCowan.com, and then on her social media, Instagram, author Kristina Cowan, and that is Kristina with a K. So
That's
don't forget that. Yeah. And we would audience, we would love to hear from you. So let's get connected. Just go to our website at momsonamission.net. That's momsonamission.net. And also drop us a line. We want to hear from you, questions, comments, and that's moms@momsonamission.net, moms@momsonamission.net.
And please follow us on your favorite platform.
Moms on a Mission is excited to partner with our friends at MyPillow. According to sleep experts and sleephealth.org, over 50 million Americans struggle to get a good night's rest. That's where MyPillow comes in. They make the best pillows, sheets, mattresses, and mattress toppers. Several years ago, I was having trouble falling and staying asleep due to neck and shoulder pain. Luckily, I heard an ad about MyPillow and decided to give it a try. After 3 or 4 days, I really began to feel a difference. I was sleeping better and my neck and shoulders felt so much better. MyPillow really does help you fall asleep faster and stay asleep longer. Moms on a Mission wants you to get a great night's rest too. Go to mypillow.com right now and use the promo code MISSION for up to 66% off your purchase. MyPillow products are made in America and have a 60-day money-back guarantee and lifetime warranty. Remember, go to mypillow.com, put in the special code MISSION for your special Moms on a Mission discount. Thank you and God bless.
Hey guys, it's Moms on a Mission here. Are you worried about your financial stability and protecting the money for which you work so hard? The problem is stock market volatility and inflation. You may be wondering what you can do to preserve your family's wealth. We at Moms on a Mission encourage you to reach out to our friend Andrew Sorcini with Beverly Hills Precious Metals. Andrew is the expert in educating you to help you find the right balance of gold and silver for your family portfolio. He made it so easy for me to add precious metals to my financial investments. I simply mailed a check to Beverly Hills Precious Metals and my silver showed up on my doorstep a few days later. It was so easy. Go to bh-pm.com to save a little money and tell them that Moms on a Mission sent you. That's bh-pm.com. Don't wait. Protect your wealth today by going to bh-pm.com and tell them that Moms on a Mission sent you.